My name is Samar Madanat. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and thank you again for coming to our Focus on Wellness series for June. We're doing SOGIE 101. And so I'm a therapist with the Eden's Counseling Group. I've been a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been in this field for about 10 years. And in that time, I've really been able to work with all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. But the community or the work that I've found myself most drawn to are working with issues of identity. So that has looked like clients of various ethnic backgrounds and the LGBTQ plus community. So a lot of my work in individual, family, couples work has been related to acceptance, transitioning, all kinds of topics in this field. So it's something I'm really passionate about. And something that I think has come up a lot in my work is that the topic in and of itself has been really overwhelming and can be confusing in terms of language and vocab, and ever evolving is something I hear a lot. It's hard to keep up. So my hope today is that we can talk about some of these terminology as it relates to gender and sexuality, kind of go over the 101, so to speak. I do want to talk about some history of gender and sexuality, as well as some interesting statistics on mental health that are related, and language that we can use to be more inclusive, accepting, and understanding of gender and sexual minorities. So what I will ask you to do throughout the presentation, if you have any questions about what I'm sharing or specific points or clarity or anything like that, I'm going to ask that you use the chat box. And what I'm also going to do is towards the end of the meeting, I do want to dedicate time to your questions and maybe topics that you'd like to discuss. So if things come up in this conversation that I haven't addressed that you would like to know more about, I'm not going to claim to have the answers to everything, but we can at least talk about it, and maybe I can point you to other resources. But I really do want to preface that there are no silly questions in this topic. We're here because we want understanding, and there's a lot we can all learn. I mean, I've certainly learned a lot from doing this work and this research. So I really hope that you feel comfortable. Anything that would be helpful in terms of clarity, I'm happy to do so, and hoping that we can have an open, honest dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. One moment. Alrighty, so SOGIE 101 is what it's called. So SOGIE stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Expression. It's a little phrase that has been used in research and academic fields. I don't really hear it anywhere else. So if you want to impress people, maybe hold on to that one. So I'm going to go through some terminology that we hear a lot in these conversations, but may not feel comfortable like defining ourselves. So I'll go through those. So the first term is sex, and just the basis of the word itself, sex, is a trait that indicates reproductive function. So essentially, can you host a pregnancy? Do you produce sperm? That's kind of the underpinnings of that delineation, is really your reproductive function. Okay. The next term is gender. So the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. So basically what we have assigned as a society in terms of mannerisms, maybe clothing, behaviors, so ways of speaking, ways of engaging with people, can be informed by our community and our culture. So we have gender norms that can be different kind of depending on where you are. For example, like female autonomy looks different in one part of the world versus another part of the world. And they can both feel that they have autonomy. It just looks different depending on the culture and the community that you personally have grown up in. But gender is essentially the stuff that we assign to the host of the pregnancy or the person who produces sperm. Sexual orientation is romantic or sexual attraction to others. Just bearing in mind that there are people who may experience one or the other, who are romantically attracted to people, but may not be sexually attracted to people. Gender identity is a person's own inherent sense of their gender. So how they identify, how they feel, male, female, or otherwise, and it can be incongruent with the sex that was assigned at birth. Gender expression is basically how we present, how we express that gender identity outwardly. So that could be our physical appearance, our clothing, our accessories, and like I said, our behaviors, our mannerisms, the way we walk, the way we speak. Our societies, our cultures, our communities, kind of explicitly or not, have kind of instilled in us what that looks like. So what it means to be a woman in Texas versus a man in Saudi Arabia. Like those are all very different and relative. But basically gender expression is how we choose to express who we are on the outside. Another term I'd like to point out is gender dysphoria. And so that's comfort or distress related to the incongruence between a person's gender identity and their sex assigned at birth. So someone who is assigned male at birth but identifies as a trans woman or identifies as a woman may experience gender dysphoria during puberty. So as they're growing facial hair, or they don't have breast tissue and their female peers are, things of that nature can contribute to gender dysphoria, where it's just I'm struggling mentally and emotionally because I'm not representing who I am on the inside, on the outside. There's an incongruence. A term that I hear a lot, and I'm sure some of us do, is cisgender or cis, CIS. And what that word basically means simply is you identify with the sex assigned at birth. So a cisgender woman was assigned female at birth and she herself identifies as a woman. So the opposite, transgender, is any person who does not identify with the sex assigned at birth. So this could be someone who is assigned male at birth but identifies as a woman, or somebody who identifies as non-binary. So they're neither male nor female or both. We'll get into that in a little bit. So really simply, cis versus trans is cis, I am born a female, I identify as a female. Trans, I was assigned female at birth and I do not identify as female. That would be an example. Non-binary, an umbrella term to describe any gender identity that does not fit into the binary of male or female. So that non-binary is an identity in itself, but it's also sort of an umbrella term. And I think we've heard all kinds of gender identities, and I imagine sometimes we hear one and we're like, I'm not quite sure what that is, or they sound similar. That's the beauty of this topic, is there's so many languages and identities and words to describe shared experiences. But I also can see the challenge in that. So a non-binary person can look like a lot of different things. So one, someone who rejects the binary. So they may identify as androgynous or agender. I'm neither male nor female. There are also non-binary people who sort of conceptualize gender as a spectrum and may identify as, for example, bigender. I identify as male or female, male and female, really just kind of depending on how they're feeling, what's going on. They're non-binary in a different way. So I know that may be kind of convoluted and confusing, but hopefully that's kind of given some insight into what the term non-binary means, because I think that's becoming more prevalent in our culture today. Another umbrella term, and I may use this interchangeably with LGBTQ plus, Another umbrella term is queer. So queer is essentially anyone who does not identify as cisgender or heterosexual. So queer can be a term that encapsulates somebody's gender identity or their sexuality. So I may say the queer community instead of LGBTQ plus. I do want to note that the word queer historically has had a negative connotation. It has typically been a slur, and I think that's more common to the experience of queer Gen Xers and queer baby boomers. This was a slur, this was derogatory, so younger generations have reappropriated this term as not only sort of empowering, but as a label and an identity. So I think it's important to be mindful of that there are people in this world who find the word queer deeply offensive and triggering, and navigating that sensitively is really important, but I do want to acknowledge that. My next slide is the gender bred person. I'm just curious, you can nod or give me a thumbs up. Has anyone ever seen this or heard of this before? Yeah. I've utilized it in sort of trainings with adolescents and parents. It feels like a digestible visual of this conversation. So identity, attraction, expression, the sex characteristics. If you look towards like the bottom half, it kind of has all of these categories. And are y'all able to see this okay? Okay, cool. So gender identity, for example, is a line, womanness and manness. And what these lines are representing is the concept that gender and sexuality are on a spectrum. And basically what that means is some may believe that no one is exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, and some people identify as such. They may be straight and have experienced same-sex attraction or vice versa. And so oftentimes I'll do this in a group, and adolescents will maybe plot where they are, or even create their own gender bred person, like what I would look like if I was my most authentic self. They have that regarding identity, expression, sexual attraction, romantic attraction. Those can also look different. So I thought that's a kind of a neat visual, and totally encourage, if people are interested in sharing that or utilizing that. Genderbred.org is the website I received that from. Okay. So something that I hear pretty commonly, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know if I said this in the beginning. So as I get questions in the chat, I'm going to dedicate some time towards the end of the meeting to review all of them. So just letting you know that I'm not ignoring you. We'll go through all the questions together. But please, as I'm talking, feel free to enter questions if they come up. So something that I hear a lot in this work is this feels new, like this doesn't feel like a thing, like gay people, queer people, trans people, this feels like, ooh, let me pause this, sorry. It just feels new. It feels like this is something that hasn't really been happening in society, and now it's just all of a sudden all at once. And I want to assure you that as long as human beings have existed, there have been people who are queer or gender creative. For example, the Hijra identity, the gender identity in Hindu society has existed for over 2,000 years. So these are people who are not male or female. Some are intersex, meaning that they may have, primary and secondary sex characteristics, reproductive characteristics of both sexes. So, that can just look different for everyone. So the Hijra identity was not male, not female. They were revered in society as connected, spiritually religious beings. Essentially, from what I've gathered in my reading, is they were seen and perceived by their peers as the most integrated beings because they had this balance of masculinity and femininity that they were able to master and hone. And there was a belief that this sort of led them to be enlightened people. These were people who conducted religious rituals and events such as blessings when a child was born, or weddings. I think that's something that we'll discuss later, as well as this connection to like prosperity and love and these people. Currently, or not currently, this is a statistic from 2014. I unfortunately couldn't find a more updated. There are about 3 million people who identify as Hydra in India, and the climate has changed. They are not as revered and as accepted as they once were. Something we'll see again shortly. Really, the sort of Western imperialism and expansion of Judeo-Christian values and principles in these contexts kind of led and facilitated instances of homophobia, transphobia, just values that did change as a result of Western expansion and colonialism. So I do want to acknowledge that. In the US, Native American people have typically identified as Two-Spirit. There are Two-Spirit people similarly to Hydra. The difference is that they could identify as male or female, as well as intersex, but they combined the activities of both men and women to their status as Two-Spirit people. So just a little different. Similarly to South Asia, they were healers, shamans, ceremonial leaders. What I thought was really interesting was that in some tribes, there were sort of like social services. They would take in elderly people, widows, sick children, orphans, and take care of them. So they were deeply revered, and they had a very functional role in their societies. They were also believed to be lucky in love and able to bestow this luck upon others. So they were often a part of like wedding celebrations and things like that. So this is just to say that trans experiences, non-binary experiences, while it looks different than what it is today, these conversations and these experiences have happened and existed without judgment and actually with celebration for more of our history as human beings than not, which I think is really important to note. So in terms of prevalence today, this is from the Pew Center research. So 1 in 6 Gen Z adults identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. And to just sort of define Gen Z, that's anyone born between 1997 and 2002. 72% of those respondents identified as bisexual. So I think that speaks to that sort of understanding that maybe younger generations are experiencing their sexuality or expressing their sexuality on a continuum, which is really interesting if we're like looking at trends regarding sexual orientation. So this is a chart from Gallup, basically with this information. So just showing sort of the rates of American adults who identify as queer. And obviously we see a huge jump in Gen Z. I think with these kinds of stats, we can take these with a grain of salt to some extent. I think generally there's underreporting. So people may not be comfortable sharing their identity. So it could be higher, even for the other generations. But we're seeing this jump in terms of people who are openly proclaiming their identities as gender and sexual minorities in this generation. So I want to talk about the impact of acceptance on one's physical health. And we're also going to talk about mental health. I'm going to share information. It's kind of targeted towards adolescents, but I do have some information regarding adults as well. So 1 in 4 queer youth are kicked out of their homes upon disclosure of their identity. In fact, up to 40% of homeless youth are queer. And that's actually been pretty consistent the last 10 years. Queer high school students and young adults are significantly more likely to report recent cannabis and alcohol use than their straight peers. So we're seeing increased substance use, increased homelessness, just simply for them being who they are. In terms of mental health and suicidality, trans youth are 3 times more likely than their cisgender counterparts to experience depression. Non-trans queer youth are more than twice as likely to feel suicidal and as over 4 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to their heterosexual counterparts. Youth with the least accepting families were more than 3 times as likely to consider and attempt suicide. And particularly with trans youth, 1 in 3 have seriously considered suicide and 1 in 5 have actually attempted. So gender, unfortunately, gender identity and sort of the acceptance or lack thereof are huge indicators for suicide risk in teens and young adults. So it's really important to, if we're working with or knowing someone who is trans and struggling, to sort of understand that there's a risk involved with not being accepted or not feeling social support in regard to their identities. So regarding adults, non-trans queer adults are twice as likely to have a mental health diagnosis than their heterosexual counterparts. The rate quadruples for transgender adults. So transgender adults in the US are 4 times as likely to have a mental health diagnosis than cisgender people. Similarly to trans youth, non-trans queer adults abuse substances at double the rate of their straight counterparts, and that rate quadruples for trans adults. So again, we're just seeing that trend of more substance use, more mental health diagnoses, more suicidality. 40% of transgender adults have attempted suicide in comparison to 5% of the general US population. That's something that really sticks out to me. That's 8 times the rate of the general US population. So it's very likely that trans people, if they haven't attempted, have really thought about it to some extent in their life and their journey. Non-trans queer adults are twice as likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual counterparts. So 10% may not feel like a lot, but when it's a discrepancy with other communities, it just shows that there's something going on. Sort of the next part of this presentation, I'm going to sort of reference things that I've heard in my work with family counseling, couples counseling, individual counseling, particularly related to identity. So the first one, how do you know? Are you sure? Is something that I've heard a lot of clients share is like the first thing someone said to them when they came out, particularly a parent. And it's, on first glance, I imagine it doesn't feel wholly inappropriate. But I think a question I pose is, when did you know you were straight? Nobody really thinks about that. It feels like a flippant question, and it's not necessarily what I mean. It's just sort of to exemplify that straight people have been absolved of that sort of expectation, like they had to make a decision or they made a choice or they sort of had consciously made this decision. It's not the case. It also implies that someone actively chose to not be straight. So we know that's not the case. So I think just generally that would be a good question to just avoid wholly. I think something else that comes up is by the time somebody shares this information, I think it's common to assume that this is a brand new thing. And I always tell parents, especially, don't assume that this is a new thing for your child. Just because they're talking to you about it now, they could have been stewing on this for years and months, or talking to other people about it and like working to tell you that. So don't assume that they're confused or unsure. I think just being open and curious, and I think instead of asking this question, saying, thank you for feeling comfortable to share this with me. Would you like to talk about this? Or I'm here for you if you want to talk about this more and unpack this together. I think would be a more appropriate response. Something else that I've heard, especially working with adolescents, that this is just a phase is pretty much up there. Like, you're going to grow out of this. I think that's dangerous because it kind of shuts down someone's ability to feel curious about their sexuality and their gender. It could very well be a phase, in this journey of understanding your own identity and experiences, that may change. Something, I guess an example that might be helpful is there's a common experience, perhaps in particularly with men, of men coming out as bisexual and ultimately identifying as gay. And that's absolutely not to say that every man who is bi is gay. That's not what I'm saying. It is sort of, and in my work, things that I have seen are claiming that biness is a way to tether me to the possibility of being straight, the possibility of continuing to be accepted, while allowing myself to explore this part of my sexual identity. And someone may very well be bisexual. I've been with women. I'm attracted to men as well, and I'm claiming that. And some people may find that in that journey, they are not attracted to women as much or at all. So that's just an example. And I think again, encouraging curiosity. Like, I'm so glad that you're thinking about this, that you're thinking about yourself, you're being introspective. It's really important. And just because they're no longer whatever identity they claim to be, that doesn't negate who they are and what they're going through. It doesn't make this fake or a fad. I think we can all relate to, in some way, sort of like that journey of self-discovery in adolescence and early adolescence, like finding out who you are, your values, what you like, your labels, your identities, the communities that you feel connected to. So it's not entirely different for queer youth. Please don't tell anyone else. I hear that quite a bit, more so in the context of like a parent to a child. That's not helpful. I think instead of asking that question, what could be helpful is, so kind of moving forward, how would you like your life to be different? Like, if someone is coming out as trans, or, I'm gay or I'm lesbian or otherwise, like, so kind of what now, what next? Like, what, maybe understanding what they see for themselves, because that might be coming out to school or coming out to this person or changing their gender expression and being more congruent at school. So the whole not telling anyone else, I think, comes from a place of protection, like wanting the person to feel protected. But we can talk about that in a different way that doesn't feel shaming. And so just saying kind of, okay, what's next? Or like, how can I support you? Or what do you see for yourself? I think would be a more appropriate way to address that. Now this one, I will admittedly kind of poke fun at, and I do believe that it comes from a place of, can come from a place of kindness and like acceptance. I've known all along. I think that even happened to me when I disclosed to a friend, and I was like, oh, what's that supposed to mean? I think it can sort of rely on that trope of like, there are certain ways you appear gay or queer. If you do this certain behavior, you are that. And it's just very reductive and stereotyping. So I think that's just a statement to avoid, even if you did, even if I kind of joke and call it a glass closet. It's not a helpful thing to say. It could easily become a shame response. So again, I think practicing gratitude, like, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for feeling safe with me. Thank you for allowing me. I think too, it's not about necessarily coming out. It is sharing who I am with you. I'm so comfortable with you. I trust you so much. I'm going to allow you to access this part of who I am. So seeing that as a privilege, and I think that can be very empowering to someone who may be struggling with the self-disclosure process. I love you anyway is something that I hear a lot. And surprisingly or not, it has actually caused a lot of pain to trans people specifically. That anyway really is the problem. I think it implies like, I love you in spite of, I love you despite, I love you even though. And it's sort of inadvertently, I never think it's the intention, but what people hear is, this is a flaw and I'm choosing to overlook that to be in relationship with you, which may not be the case. And we never, if that's not the case, we don't want people to feel like, I love you in spite of this defect, because it's not the case. Some more language to avoid. What are your preferred pronouns? I think really the problem is the word preferred. Preferred implies that one has a choice to use your correct pronouns or not. It's not a preference, it's who you are. If you're a woman, you don't prefer to use she pronouns, you use she pronouns. And I was gonna reference this, but I forgot to do it. So at the beginning of the presentation, or typically when I meet people, I think the way to sort of navigate pronouns, and it's obviously something I can get into the habit of saying, hi, my name is so-and-so, I use X pronouns. You can ask someone, are you comfortable sharing your pronouns with me? Introducing yourself with your pronouns is a way to create that space without explicitly asking someone. So people may feel less on the spot when you say, hi, my name is Sam, or I use any pronouns. And you may invite that response, I'm so-and-so, I use these pronouns. But if you want to ask, I think the best thing to do is to say, what are your pronouns, if you don't mind me asking. Dead naming is using the name of a transgender person before they changed their name and when they were not living in congruence with their gender identity. I think this can be particularly triggering to people who have transitioned, and it's really something to avoid. Obviously, we make mistakes. I think I've seen this in relationships where, I knew this person, my child, obviously, or my partner, we were together before they transitioned, and having a new name, that can be really tough in the beginning to sort of get adjusted to. So, it's not the end of the world. You're not a terrible person if you make mistakes. I think being intentional about working on it is really key, and correcting yourself. So if you dead name someone, you immediately say the correct name, you apologize, and you move forward in the conversation. If they want to process it, that's totally fair. But just, being mindful of it, that it takes time and patience and effort. Now the next one, it's terminology that was until recently pretty widely accepted. I think now we have more kind of an unnuanced understanding of why certain these terms might not be the best. So using phrases like female to male, male to female, he, she, he used to be a boy, she used to be a girl. That terminology in and of itself really reinforces the idea that someone chose to be trans, or just that innate, like, you changed who you were. You were a boy and you're now a girl, or vice versa. And how trans people have categorized it or reflected their inner experience is that I have always been this person, and I was just kind of socialized in a different way. Kind of an image was projected onto me. So I frame it as such. If this is a woman, she's always been a woman, it's always been who she is. We just, she was assigned male or whatever the case is, and was socialized to be such, that she is a woman. If she identifies as a woman, she is a woman. So just framing it as such, maybe not using that terminology. I said gender and sexual minorities in the beginning. I think that can also, from a strengths-based perspective, maybe not be the best terminology to use. I'll call myself out. You can say gender and sexually diverse communities. If anyone has like a nice, I feel like sometimes it can feel clunky. People have terms that have worked for them or they've heard or they're curious about. You can let me know in the comments. But avoiding sort of the blank to blank, I think would be best. Another thing I would avoid, or I would caution you to avoid, is sort of bringing up surgery and medical intervention when someone discloses their transness to you. Not everyone who is trans wants to medically transition. And when I say medically transition, I mean doing hormone replacement therapy or testosterone blockers. That would also be a part of hormone replacement therapy. Or top surgery, bottom surgery, facial feminization, electrolysis, stuff like that. Again, not everyone who is trans wants to medically transition. So I wouldn't really bring it up unless someone brings it up. If they want to process it, if they are thinking about it, just any way you can be supportive. Let me know how I can help you. Whatever that may look like. Maybe going to appointments or helping them with post-op. I think it's obviously something that you might be curious about, especially if it's a loved one. Like, what does this mean for you? Like, moving forward, what is life going to look like for you? And so this is a valid question or concern, but maybe allowing that person to take the lead on that, because again, we don't want to reinforce ideas like you have to medically transition to be trans. That's not accurate. I do want to share some resources that have been really helpful. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion, general discussion. So Southern Equality is really cool, actually. It is a website that's a guide for local affirming service providers. So MDs, therapists. It's a newer directory, so I think they're still building those resources, but they do have one for Texas. They have practitioners in Houston and all over the state. So if you ever have a friend or you yourself are interested in working with someone who is affirming to gender and sexually creative communities, I would encourage you to check out Southern Equality or have them check out Southern Equality. PFLAG Houston is another organization. I've actually attended a PFLAG meeting. So that's Parents and Families of Lesbians and Gays. Not the most inclusive name, but I think they do great work. They have meetings, sort of general community meetings. I've seen queer people bring family members. They have educational resources, educational events. They have all kinds of stuff going on. I believe they still meet in Midtown. I could be wrong. They used to meet at this Methodist church like across the street from the Fine Arts Museum, but that was several years ago. So I would go to their website to kind of get the most updated information on what they're doing. The National Center for Transgender Equality is a fabulous resource. I've gotten so much statistical information, research, just a wealth of knowledge about sort of the health outcomes, all of these things that we've discussed today. And also they're great at, like, if you're trying to find a local organization to support or get services from, that they have that information as well. Similarly, as does the Trevor Project. So these are all, if you're trying to just gain more general knowledge of this topic or finding local providers or just local organizations, these are great resources to access. So I completely encourage you to do that. And if you have any questions about these things, you can totally reach out, let me know. I did not include my email in the slides. I apologize, but I will do that in the chat shortly. Okay, so that was my presentation. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about, I'm going to look at the questions, read them aloud, and we'll discuss them together. Please feel free to add anything. And you're muted, so if you want to speak, or you can use the chat or unmute. But if someone else is talking, please mute yourself. Yeah, so Chris said, I definitely prefer the phrase gender and sexually diverse communities. Yeah, I think it's about a strength-based perspective. Minorities, it implies just sort of a lack of power, a lack of privilege, lack of access. And while that may be true, it's not necessarily like how we want to frame the community. So that's something I need to work on. What is the best way to find gender affirming therapists? Great question. Thank you, Brittany. What I have found helpful, what I've directed even people in my personal life to do. So Psychology Today is a great website that you can search for a therapist by zip code. And what I appreciate about Psychology Today is that they have search filters. So you can filter your insurance, you can filter the topics you're going to want to address in therapy, the types of therapy, the interventions that you are interested in, like DBT, CBT, stuff like that. One other piece of that is LGBTQ+. So you're able to click on it and find providers who have disclosed that they work with this community. But further than that, something I would recommend is that, let's say you do that, you find a therapist. Most therapists, you can schedule a consult. And I think it's important to talk about that. So contacting someone you're interested in and saying, tell me about your experience with this population. Like, do you see people like me? Have you worked with the issues that I'm navigating? And just being really open and honest. There's nothing wrong with having a conversation like that and saying, maybe you're not the person for me. You're taking time out of your day and your life to do this work. And so it's really important that you find someone that is a good fit and a good match. And I think what I hear often is like, it's hard to process things and also educate your therapist. And to some extent, it's not necessarily your job to educate your therapist. Obviously, in getting to know you, we'll learn things, but therapists also have the obligation to educate themselves and to be advocates for social justice and to just be at the forefront of the field, to be quite frank. So I think any therapist, it would behoove them to really explore that. And I think it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask them about their experience. So Psychology Today, Southern Equality has a provider list, and I imagine like Trevor Project and the other organizations I've listed will have community health clinics, maybe, that have individual therapists, family therapists, couple therapists. So even contacting local LGBTQ+ organizations in your city and saying, hi, do you provide mental health services? And then going from there. So there's quite a few different options. But if anyone else knows of other resources to locate queer therapists, please feel free to share that. Any other questions, or are there things that we're curious about that was not addressed? It can even be just terms. Like I kind of gave an overview, but there's even terms I see and I'm like, I don't know if I know what that means. So anything like that? Any books? I personally don't, which feels, silly to say, but really a lot of the work, a lot of my knowledge has really been from my own personal life, my experiences in counseling. I will have to get back to you on that. So I'm happy to consult colleagues, or if anyone else here has recommendations for books that have been helpful, that would be great. I admit that's something I probably could have looked into, but again, these websites are great resources. I think going to any organization that has peer support groups can also be really helpful. I know locally the Mantra Center has a coming out support group. They have a trans fabulous support group. So finding communities, I think, can also be really helpful. Chris asked, who can claim queer identity? I've encountered cisgender and heterosexual people who identify as queer. Do you have any insights? That's a great question, Chris. Thank you for asking that. That is, and it's like when we get into we get bogged into it, this is, I think, when it can feel really convoluted and confusing. I think regarding this experience, that's totally valid. I harken back to sexuality as a spectrum. For example, there could be someone, and I'm sure there are people who identify as gay. They're gay men. I marry gay men, date gay men, but I have had sexual experiences with women, for example, or I generally am with men, but I have had romantic attraction to women, romantic relationships. So while they may generally appear cis hetero, if we're really conceptualizing their identity as on a spectrum, then they can claim queerness if that is their lived experience. Cool. Any other questions, thoughts, concerns, something that would be helpful to address? We have about 10 minutes. Or terms, like I've heard this term and I am just I'm not sure what that's about. Or even just maybe navigating conversations with coworkers, friends, peers, with clinicians. Mm. That's a really good question that Chris is asking, so I'll read it out loud. What if a client does not want to be homosexual or transgender and they are interested in conversion treatment? Is it ethical to refer them to a program like that? I want to say no. I want to say it's not ethical, because social work, so I'm a social worker, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So my code of ethics, I am obligated to be an advocate for social justice. And I believe the NASW has condemned conversion therapy wholly. It's not valid, it's harmful. I'm gonna feel horrible if I'm misspeaking. But I believe there's literature on the profession that this is not a thing, that this is not okay. On that basis, I would probably tell someone we're just not, my ethics, my values as a professional, your goals are not compatible. And I unfortunately, I cannot refer you to those services. I wouldn't even maybe explain why. I'm not aware of them. You can say it's not ethical, but I think that's challenging because we're obviously navigating someone who's really struggling with where they're at. And say, try to create as minimal harm as possible and meeting someone where they're at, just kind of keeping it at, I don't think we're a good match, and I cannot refer you to those services. I'm just not aware of them. I don't know if that's like the best response, but I feel like it's the most practical, the most realistic, because the last thing I would want to do as a clinician is put someone in a traumatic situation. Do no harm. Any other last minute thoughts, questions? I'm going to there's an evaluation form. I don't know what's happening. Okay. There is a evaluation form that I put it in the chat. I'm just going to repost it again. And then I'm going to share my email. So if you have any follow-up questions or you want to just kind of have a conversation offline, you have referrals or just whatever, please feel free to reach out. I don't want to like plug my services, but I work with individuals, I work with adolescents, adults, I work with couples and families, not just related to queerness and multiculturalism, anxiety, depression, substance use, all kinds of issues. And you can check out the EDINS counseling group. We're similar into what I shared with Psychology Today. So if there's specific topics that you want to work on in therapy or specific modalities, we have therapists that are using those, so you'll be able to find your fit. You can call our intake line and they can assist you with finding a good fit. But if you just want to chat about this, I'm so open to this conversation because it is a passion of mine to talk about gender and sexuality with people and to raise support and understanding. So if you ever have a question or a thought or a concern, or just want more info or more resources, I'm happy to have those conversations. And if you could fill out the feedback form, that would be great. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Just any feedback that can make this better and just more relevant, I'm happy to make those changes. Well, thank you for your time. Again, everyone, thank you for coming to EDINS Counseling Group Focus on Wellness, SOGIE 101. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day and week. Thanks. I appreciate it, Kelly. You take care. Bye-bye all.